It probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that wars aren't just fought with weapons. Ideas and stories can have just as much of an impact as a missile. And the global reach of the internet has allowed countries to amplify ideas and stories, weaponizing them at a scale like never seen before. Right now, across Southeast Asia, China is weaving narratives that challenge Western powers' influence in the region, and the United States' role as a global leader. Through tailored messaging, China is attempting to drive a wedge between the US and its allies and shift the balance of power for good. Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. As always, I'm your host, Pete Zaroka, and each week we talk with the researchers behind this work, minus the jargon, and definitely minus the lab coat. To learn about these subversive influence campaigns, we're joined by PJ Allin. She's a researcher in the Global Security Initiative's Center on Information and Narrative Complexity, and a PhD candidate in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at ASU. She spent years on the front line of this narrative battlefield, tracing how these campaigns spread and change over time. We discuss how China and other authoritarian regimes are using these tools to reshape the world order, and why it matters, even if it's happening on the other side of the globe. PJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Pete. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
We had you on today because you worked on a very interesting project. It was looking at narrative influence campaigns in East Asia. Can you give me kind of a brief overview of what that project was, and then we can kind of dig into it a little bit?
Sure. This project was looking at Chinese influence operations in Southeast Asia. We took 3 case studies, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Our methodology was looking at fusing computational social media methods, like an ethnographic perspective, by including the perspectives of subject matter experts on the ground, to be able to put together an understanding of what is China doing in the region, how is it trying to promote its vision of a new world order and a regional architecture that fits all of its interests, and how is it trying to degrade our current understanding of what security looks like, and get rid of like the U.S. presence in the region.
Okay, so these ideas, these messages, what if you had to characterize it as a whole? What was the big message that they're sending to Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines? Like, what was there a central message? In some ways there were unifying messages to all 3, but then there were also, we noticed, some strategic ways that they could kind of tailor those messages to each country. So some unifying messages were regionally very similar. Okay.
We go back thousands of years of cross, culture collaboration, heritage. So we have so much that's the same, right? And there are these other actors who are not a part of Asia or Southeast Asia, who aren't within our neighborhood, who are trying to create like this sort of external foreign interference, which we don't welcome or we don't think necessary for our own security as a whole. So it kind of relates to like pan-national Asian,
like a shared cultural and ethnic identity and set of values, basically?
Yeah, pan-Asianism.
Okay.
A little bit. It can be broader to more of a global South solidarity kind of narrative, where even though China's the second largest economy in the world and not what we would consider a developing country, it can kind of position itself as the champion of the global South and can historically identify from decades before that it's one of them, but it's risen in a very successful way, and it can teach everybody else how it did that so that they can have the same future.
It's part of their like it's part of their national story,
Yeah.
right? And being an ascendant country.
Yeah.
And you gesture towards other actors in the region. So you're talking largely about Western powers, right?
Mostly, yeah.
So, and those are the messages that, or those are the, I should say, when we talk about Western powers, those are the kind of, that's the influence that China is trying to combat in this region, right? So like broadly speaking, the message China is sending is the West doesn't belong here. Maybe the West is in decline and Asia, and we're ascendant, right? Is that more or less it?
Yeah, I would say so.
So when you gave me kind of a description of this project, you said that, China was trying to change the information environment. Specifically, what are you talking about? Are you talking traditional media? Are you talking online? Like, is it a mix of the two? Can you tell me more about that?
Sure, yeah. So, well, first of all, like when we talk about influence, all countries influence other countries.
No.
To the degree they can, right?
Yeah.
And using the instruments of power that they have available to them. So historically, that's been, military coercion, maybe economic coercion through sanctions, but political and like more diplomatic persuasion, and also the information environment. And the information environment is a newer one because with what's happened with technology and the internet and what it's allowed, these channels of communication to mean is that China has kind of this new access, and all countries do, right?
Yeah.
So what China will do is it'll have its state-sponsored news media, so Chinese state media, which kind of looks and acts on the surface as if it's very similar to what a Western sort of media outlet would look like, formatted the same way and everything, and framed to look as if it has the same journalistic principles behind it.
Yeah.
It is fully state-funded, and it and everything that gets published on those outlets are what the Chinese Communist Party, it's part of their overall narrative and their official positions on policies, and it doesn't distract from, it doesn't criticize, or it doesn't take any angles that the government is not okay with.
Sure.
So those are, all over the place. There's CCTV, China Daily, the Global Times, which is more like a tabloid. And so all kinds.
And these are media
of
exports, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Like they go to the whole region.
Yeah, they're in different languages. They're in English. And then they'll do like what Western media will do, where they'll have their own social media accounts as well.
Okay.
So then they look like social media news.
It's the whole information landscape, it sounds like. Earlier you talked about how they tailored messages to each country based on the country. So let's take the Philippines, for example.
Yeah.
What are some messages you saw targeted toward the Philippines that were different from Malaysia or Indonesia?
Yeah, so the Philippines is a great example to start with, and largely because what's going on is, even though each country is very similar, they're all within Southeast Asia, they do have very different kind of demographics and also just characteristics and histories. So they're very diverse. But one important thing that is very important to the Philippines is its mutual defense treaty with the United States, which has existed since 1951 and is formalized through the Visiting Forces Agreement. So that's a formal alliance that the U.S. has. So, if one country were to get into a conflict, it would be under international law that the other country would help out, and vice versa.
Okay.
So this is a threat to China for several reasons. First, the U.S. works in collaboration with the Philippines to put together U.S. bases and shared bases that the Philippines Navy and Army can also use. They're increasing their bases recently, and they have some that go into some of the northern islands of the Philippines, which is basically as close to Taiwan as you can get without being on an island. As basically, it's as close as you can get there.
Yeah.
And there are some Japanese islands that are also pretty close. So if a conflict like that were to happen, presumably, it's very likely that the U.S., assuming they still have their relationship with the Philippines, would use Filipino territory if something like that were to happen.
So to summarize, the Philippines and Japan, they offer like important strategic locations for the U.S. military.
Yeah.
Specifically in relation to Taiwan. Is Taiwan important to China in some way?
Yes.
I'm kidding. That was a joke. But please. I'm not that clueless.
There aren't very many places in the world that exist the way Taiwan does, especially because of its semiconductor industry.
Yeah.
We can see sort of what's happened in Hong Kong in recent years, and there wasn't as much that could really happen with Hong Kong, but Taiwan's a little different because even though very few countries around the world will officially say it's a sovereign state, it acts in every possible way as if it is one. So it holds its own elections, it has its own government, it has its own military. So it's acting as if it is a country, even though no one's really saying that it is one.
And no one will say it is to not provoke China.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
So, but sorry, I got us off topic.
That's okay.
You were talking about messages to the Philippines.
Right. So for China, this relationship, this alliance within the Philippines and the U.S. is very close to home. So it's threatening to China, not only because of Taiwan, but also because of the South China Sea.
Yeah.
So China has put together something called the 9-dash line, which essentially an analogy that you could use that I've heard others use is it would be like if Italy claimed the entire Mediterranean Sea because of its Roman civilization. Like it's a huge swath of like open water that's not legal internationally. The Philippines actually had a tribunal and an international law that came out and said we do not recognize China's claims to this, but China will still patrol the areas and bully and harass the Philippines on certain islands. China's not happy with this U.S. presence here. So it will put out these narratives to the Philippine public, basically destroying and undermining the U.S. in every way. So it's very anti-American narratives. It's anti-colonial, right? So they'll use America's history of having previously colonized the Philippines, originally because they won the Spanish-American War. So they kind of inherited the Philippines from Spain.
Right.
But they continued on like this colonialization, which was not good. But what ended up kind of happening because of that colonialization and that history was the two countries became closer, and now that relationship has changed and it's a partnership, mutually beneficial, but China can still kind of use these seeds and these old narratives of continued colonization so they can frame what America is doing as, neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. And it's gaining traction. There's the previous president was Rodrigo Duterte, who was very close to actually terminating the visiting forces agreement in 2020.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. And to be clear, that would have like totally shaken up the balance of power in this South Pacific.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was a ton of narratives going on in the information space about, which side is legitimate.
All right. So China's playing on historical wrongs by the United States against the Filipinos to try to drive a wedge there for their own benefit. What about Indonesia? What kind of tailored messages did you see, which I assume like they're for the same ends, right? To drive a wedge between Indonesia and the U.S. First, what does the relationship between the Indonesia and U.S. look like? And secondly, what were the messages that were trying to separate them?
Sure. For Indonesia, it was the urgency to kind of create that wedge between Indonesia and its partnership with the U.S. is not as important because it's geographically they're more to the south, so they're not. Their claims in the South China Sea are also they're there, but they're minimal compared to the Philippines and and the Taiwan equation is not there either. So and because China's kind of trying to do this within all kind of global South countries and developing countries is to drive this idea that the U.S. is no longer fit to be a hegemon, which is like the number one superpower, like who has unilateral power, right? So they're irresponsible. They don't want that position anyway, and they'll do that by persuading the global South that they'll have better opportunities under China's vision than they currently do.
Okay.
So in Indonesia, though, it's a different demographic. So Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, actually, after
By
the US.
population?
Yeah.
Wow.
Fourth.
Okay.
Yeah. But the other thing that Indonesia is it's the largest Muslim majority country. So it surpassed Pakistan as having like the most Muslims by population in its country. With that, China can kind of prioritize narratives that are more related to Islam and that resonate with like this Indonesian identity that's a lot more related to Islam, right? And to being Muslim. China does that with varying degrees of success. So it's very good at painting and framing the United States as being very anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. The irony is that in the northwest of China, Xinjiang, they are what some Western countries have actually called a genocide. They've taken like it's hard to know exactly how many people, but some accounts are like 1 million people into what they would call re-education camps. But, with brutal conditions, and what they really are trying to do is erase their religion from them.
And this is the Uyghur people,
yes,
right?
the Uyghurs, yeah.
Okay.
So it's very interesting, though, that China can frame itself as an ally of Islam and just make their whole Uyghur issue become basically not relevant or like just not even something that Muslim countries themselves as a whole will even speak up on.
So how do you characterize this strategy? Hard power would be economic sanctions or military action, right? And soft power is like diplomacy. Does this fall somewhere in the middle? Is it? I would think it's closer to soft power. What is your analysis of that?
That's a good question. Joseph Nye is an international relations scholar who put those two terms together in the 1990s.
Okay.
The original ones being hard power and soft power. And then there was this, in like 2017 or relatively recently, a new concept came out called sharp power.
Sharp power.
Yeah. And it's kind of unclear to me whether sharp power is its own full entity or if it's just kind of a mix of soft and hard power. So you can think of hard power as coercion and soft power as voluntary, like I voluntarily agree to do this because it sounds good, versus coercion, I'm being coerced to do this. So there are two ways of influencing behavior change. But what some might say sharp power is doing is like, it's like coercive persuasion. So it's kind of like mixing the two.
Sure.
And others will say sharp power is distinct and different enough to be its own category, because at the time Joseph Nye was thinking, the landscape of what was going on was like, it's the end of the Cold War. The U.S., like the Soviet Union has disintegrated. The U.S. has no enemies. So he was very much kind of thinking of those concepts with this like American lens and a Western lens for, how is influence kind of, and in this globalized world, it spreads across, like McDonald's is in however many countries in the world and stuff like that. But I think authoritarian countries didn't know how to deal with the internet and social media. People thought every country was going to turn democratic in like the late 90s and early 2000s because it seemed like we have all this freedom we can meet together, people with the same ideas can come together, we can mobilize. It's this new opportunity for liberation. And
the internet specifically.
Yeah, that's what people thought at the beginning. And then you had like the Arab Spring and all sorts of kind of like social movements for more democracy.
Which a lot of them got their start and were fueled by social media.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. But so everyone was very optimistic. But then these authoritarians became a lot more technocratic, more savvy with the technology and technology is just a tool, right? It can be used positively or negatively. And if you're savvy enough to know how to do that, the tides can turn. So now the internet and social media they've succeeded in being able to use it as a repressive tactic. So things are very different. And like Freedom House puts together a democracy report every year, and the amount of countries that are democratic or that have certain democratic scores, Like you might not be 100%, but those numbers are dwindling pretty much every year. So we have very much fewer democratic countries now than we did back in like the 2010s.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, so is this project kind of a salve to that, do you think? Like, or, I mean, it's not going to solve the problem of like,
Yeah.
it's not going to solve the problem of
Yeah.
diminishing democracies across the
No.
world, obviously, but it can it be used to mitigate some of the influence we're seeing from authoritarian regimes online?
I hope so. Yeah, I think with more understanding of what's going on and awareness, I think people can. I think even that in itself is already a defense mechanism. Knowing more about it helps you helps a country with its resilience and on how it decides to combat these new tactics, right? And what these tactics are essentially the way modern warfare operates. So it is defense related, it's national security related, and it is, I think, something countries do kind of need to be prioritizing as they move forward. How can they, contain their nationalism but not let it get too extreme in any way, but at the same time not letting the divisions overpower how they might want to make healthy decisions for everybody.
Do you think that there are any actionable policy recommendations based on this research that you've done?
I personally would say keep funding it.
Okay.
But some might say, we don't need to protect our country from lies or from like just different framing. Our own individuals can know for themselves, and make their own decisions based on what they see. So there is like this opposing policy direction. But I would say, if you have foreign adversaries that are, this is a strategy that they've had like institutionalized into their military doctrines since the Cold War, and now with technology have been able to even amplify those efforts even more than they used to be doing. I'd say that's something we probably need to like have our eyes on.
So pick that apart for me. When you say it's been institutionalized into their military doctrine since the Cold War, you're specifically talking about using strategic narratives to influence public opinion in other countries and therefore destabilize them?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. This research was previously funded by a Department of Defense program called Minerva Research Initiative. It was shuttered in 2025. And that's because of, realignment of priorities on a federal level.
The idea of the Minerva was kind of to like bridge this gap between academics and, what academics do know that can be helpful so that policy mistakes don't happen. How can we create that communication better?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say too, part of what's hard with social science research is like with STEM, you can create a product with X amount of money and say, you can apply this to this situation and it's gonna improve efficiency by this much, and it's like a product that you can kind of hand over. With social science research, it's just not like that.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, I think a lot of people were finding it hard to see the value of, well, you just did all this work and we can't really see what the outcomes are. So yeah.
Well, what are the outcomes then? Like if someone is skeptical of social science research, like what do you tell them? Like what's the value?
Yeah. If you think about war, historic conceptions of what war is and now what modern war is now, it's human based. And so what we are looking at is the human elements of war, the human impacts of what that is, right? They're creating culture, they're creating their social networks and their communities. And this is fundamentally what social science is looking at. And applying that to war is very useful, especially when you have what these actors are kind of doing is they're not targeting, like another word for it is cognitive warfare. And it's more in like the psychological realm, but it's not taking humans as the targets, but it's taking their decision-making process and manipulating their decision-making process for the benefit of an adversary.
And by losing funding for social science, like we're going to miss those human elements.
Yeah.
We might misunderstand how other countries perceive the United States and what we have to lose in that region, right?
Yeah, right.
Has working on this project, and maybe just your education in general, has this changed how you interact with information online? Are you ever scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and you see something and it tweaks something in your brain where you wonder like, okay, well, who's behind this messaging, and like what narrative is this trying to push?
A little bit. First of all, since being on this project, I've stopped using social media. I never used to, but it's not something I do anymore. Even just a few years ago, at being able to tell, yeah, this post might be trying to influence my brain. Like if it's saying something that really creates this emotional reaction from me, or is trying to, adhere to some sort of identity and kind of put this narrative into perspective of morality, who's right and who's wrong, then I can identify that better than I used to and kind of question myself before further going into that. But at the same time, we all have our biases, and I'm just as susceptible in some ways to anybody else who might see something that resonates with them. So what that kind of the conclusion of that is, like, we need to have empathy for people who believe this stuff. The strategy that goes into it is leaning in on the biases to bring us to a conclusion, even if all the pieces aren't perfectly fitting together. It's that's what it's trying to do.
It's interesting that you specifically called out like the emotional response part of it, because I certainly see things online where I wonder, like, are these a bunch of astroturfed accounts that are kind of pushing the same message? But I never really, the emotional response part of it, where like something makes me instantly angry, I never necessarily perceive that as being part of strategic influence, because like the algorithm incentivizes that. So of course people are going to like do inflammatory things. So that doesn't quite square with my experience. Not to say you're wrong. It's just like I never considered that the emotional, the provocation part of it might be part of narrative influence as well.
Yes. Yeah, they call it narrative fidelity and coherence, as you're likely to believe a narrative if it aligns with your current worldview, and if it's strung together in a way that's relatively coherent.
Interesting. Yeah. What are kind of the next steps for this work? Like, what are you and your colleagues planning to do with this line of inquiry?
Sure. So two things. First is I've based my PhD is inspired kind of by this project. I was a young scholar when I started, and I really liked it and wanted to carry it forward. So I'm taking that on. I'm changing it a little bit. I'm thinking of it more from an ontological and epistemic viewpoint. So
break that down for me.
So ontology being what is reality?
Okay.
Very simply. And then epistemology being who gets to say what is true, what is our reality, what people have the authority to say that. So before, those people may have been scientists and bureaucrats. Maybe now it's influencers, right? So the epistemology is shifting.
Sure.
Maybe the authority, that voice of authority, is the Chinese Communist Party.
Sure.
So, and then the second thing I'm doing is I'm trying to break down the mechanisms of how that influence is being pursued. So, and I have 4 categories. So, problem framing. How is something getting framed as a problem? Because that's the way a narrative always starts. Like you have to have a problem, and then a middle, beginning and end with characters. Often an adversary and a hero. There's this arc of events that happen, and then it leads to some sort of resolution or a desired resolution. But the seed is that it starts with a problem. Yeah. So that's number 1, problem. Number 2 is identity formation. In what ways are we creating identity with different groups and in different ways? The third one is norms. So what existing norms do we have that we're trying to shift into these new norms that weren't norms before but are increasingly kind of becoming the mainstream? And then fourth being authority. Okay. Moral authority. How is authority getting asserted? So I'm kind of trying to piece those 4 sort of mechanisms or elements and kind of make it more replicable, kind of put together this model that can kind of tell us a little bit more about what's going on.
In the world and in the information landscape in general?
Yes, but I'm still looking at China's influence ops in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
So still the same kind of area.
This was a little depressing. I'm not going to lie, TJ.
I know.
Well, it's no, I mean, I find it intensely interesting. Change is interesting.
Yeah.
And the world is always changing. But I don't know, maybe I'm showing my age too, where it's like the world I grew up in is definitely not here anymore. In sense of what the world order is. And kind of tracking how other countries are trying to like shape and influence that is really interesting. And I really appreciate you coming on the show and making me a little sad, but interested. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into Lab Coat Optional. We are a production of the Strategic Marketing Communications team at Arizona State University's Knowledge Enterprise. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. And if you found us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We are at the mercy of the mighty, fickle algorithms, and stuff like that helps people find the show. As always, lab coats are optional on this show, but we want to keep our researchers safe in the lab. So wear your PPE. Until next time, stay curious.